They kept the ledger in a metal cabinet behind the old shipping crates, a narrow, dusty volume with a buckled cover and a spine that had the faint smell of paper and cedar. It looked like a thing no one expected to open again. Yellowed pages, penciled numbers, an iron clasp that had long ago stopped doing its job. For years it had sat in the background of the museum's storage room, a quiet witness to humidity and the slow drift of sunlight through clear-story windows. Nobody thought to look there for scandal or revelation. They thought only of boxes and tags, of accession numbers, and the slow, ordinary work of keeping a collection alive. But sometimes the quiet things are the truest things. If you work in museums as curators, registrars, or volunteers, you learn to read lists the way others read faces. A name on a ledger can tell you where an object came from, how it moved, even who wanted it to be seen. Numbers become fingerprints. Dates become a kind of voice. So when the new registrar, a woman named Mira, set the ledger on her desk and began to cross-reference a dozen accession files, she expected tedium. She did not expect to find a lie the size of a building. At first, the anomalies were small. A painting catalogued as acquired 1978. Donor private collection had an accession number that skipped a whole series at the end of the year. A set of 18th century silver, listed in the ledger as gift from estate, had a weight that matched a set sold in auction notices from a decade earlier. A typed card in the museum database said one thing. The ledger, in careful cursive, said another. Mira did what registrars always do. She followed the thread. She pulled crates, read old correspondence, tracked the wax seals on envelopes, and called distant libraries. Every answer produced two more questions. The ledger, it turned out, was not a ledger at all in the way the museum had treated it. Not a mere administrative record, but a map of choices someone had made when no one was looking. Choices that had quietly rewritten the museum's story. If museums are repositories of memory, they are also institutions of power. We trust them to tell us what matters, to preserve what matters, and to tell us honestly how it came to matter. When that trust is eroded, the betrayal feels personal. For local communities, a museum can be the keeper of a shared past. For collectors, it is a place where objects are lifted from circulation and given a new life of public meaning. And yet, power can also be seduction. Artifacts turn into assets. Provenance becomes a currency, and the stories needed to justify acquisitions can be smoothed, exaggerated, or, in rare cases, invented. The ledger's ink had dried into a language of economy. Acquisition dates, donor names, brief notes. At the top of one page, a carefully written entry recorded a parcel, a small reliquary, probable 16th C, bequest estate of H. Carrington. Next to it, in a different hand and a faint pencil, someone had written, C. Correspondence, 1970, Isechi. That pencil note became the first red flag. The correspondence did not exist in the file. There was no letter, no deed, no memorandum. The accession card printed for visitors said the reliquary came from a European estate, gift, 1978. In the ledger, the date was 1976. In the museum's publicity, the provenance had been polished, donated by a private family. Previously, in a European collection, provenance is a delicate thing. It is a chain of ownership that gives an object its human context. For centuries, collectors and dealers have woven stories to make objects more saleable, more valuable. But provenance does more than inflate prices. It constructs narratives about where things belong, which histories are honored and which are hidden. What Mira began to suspect, through the ledger's quiet inconsistencies, was not carelessness, but a pattern, a practice of smoothing edges until the past fit the museum's preferred story. To test that hypothesis, she asked for help. Not loud, public help, but the kind of discreet, professional help that museums call when they want a second pair of eyes. A provenance researcher arrived with soft shoes and a patient voice. He brought with him a scanner, a lamp, and a way of saying the obvious without judgment. Never assume an institutional record is infallible. Together, they traced every odd line in the ledger, like tributaries on a map. They requested microfilm of auction catalogues, digitized shipping manifests, and old estate inventories. They sent polite letters to the families whose names appeared as donors. Each donor required a conversation that sometimes began with confusion and then became more interesting. One family remembered the chest of silver their great-uncle had sold in 1969, before the museum claimed to have received anything from his estate. Another correspondent produced a photograph of a ceremony in which the donation had been signed, except in the picture, the date stamp on the photographer's print said 1981, 3 years after the ledger's date. The more they found, the more the ledger seemed to hum with the echo of a different truth. The suddenness of the ledger's revelations splintered the neat narrative the museum had handed to the public for decades. It was not a single fraudulent act. It was a culture. Items had been relabeled, dates adjusted, and origin stories simplified until the museum's holdings fit comfortably in brochures and lanes of regional pride. Some of the entries suggested that donations had been backdated, making it appear that the museum had secured objects earlier than it actually had. Why would anyone do that? The answers were messy. To align with the tenure of a director, to enhance a new wing's opening, to secure reputational momentum. Small choices stacked up into a robust architecture of convenience and prestige. When institutions conceal, it is often because they want to protect something larger, a reputation, a bequest, a program. But concealment also leaves an ethical residue. When an object's provenance is unclear, it raises the possibility of displacement, that the thing on display may have been stripped from a family under duress, sold under duress, or misappropriated during conflict. The ledger's faint pencil notes became a moral call. Each discrepancy had to be answered, not just for the museum's credibility, but for the memory of the people whose lives touched those objects. The smallest revelation, in this case, had an outsized consequence. Tucked between a listing for a tableau, 19th C, and an entry for set of medals, was a single line that read, S. Ibrahim, Cairo, purchase. It was a bland entry, the kind of administrative shorthand that archivists use to remind themselves where something came from. Yet, when Myra and her team looked into the name, they found a connection that opened the door into mid-20th century. Networks of trade that had moved artifacts across borders in ways that were sometimes legal, sometimes ambiguous, and sometimes plainly exploitative. The painting, listed as 19th C, had stylistic features tied to a small region whose historians remembered a period of looting and displacement during a war decades earlier. This discovery forced a deeper reckoning. The museum, which had been a regional pride for generations, now had to ask whether it had benefited knowingly or not from the misfortune of others. The registrar's quiet desk had become the hinge for a public conversation about how history is preserved and who has the right to tell it. What followed was slow and painful. The museum convened a committee. They issued a press release that used carefully measured language. We are reviewing historical records. The director, a figure beloved for decades and credited with transforming the institution from a small gallery into a cultural anchor, faced questions he had never been asked in public. The community, which had once rallied behind the museum's new wings and gala evenings, now watched press conferences with a different kind of attention. Experts were brought in, an art historian who specialized in provenance, a legal scholar who had worked on restitution cases, and a local elder whose family remembered the ways art had moved across continents. Their voices, when woven into the museum's narrative, complicated and corrected earlier claims. The art historian explained how stylistic elements, old varnish patterns, and the presence of certain pigments could reveal an object's likely origin, centuries before institutions declared them to be so. The legal scholar laid out the frameworks by which museums could trace ownership in cases of harm, return objects to rightful heirs. There were moments of nuance and mercy. Not every discrepancy meant malice. Some records were poor because bureaucracies change. Some donors misremember dates. Some paperwork is lost in wars or disasters. But there were also moments of clear ethical failing, files that should have been kept but were not, letters that suggested active erasure of provenance details, and a series of accessions clustered around the director's final years that suggested a rush to secure prestige before retirement. As the investigations progressed, a difficult and necessary transparency emerged. The museum published an online catalog where items with contested provenance were flagged. They invited community members to come to the archives and tell their stories. They offered grants for provenance research and promised to return items if conclusive evidence showed they had been wrongfully removed. From their original contexts, it was messy, it was public, it was human. There was also an unexpected human redemption in the ledger's discovery. In one case, the family of a small coastal village in southern Europe contacted the museum after recognizing a carving that had been displayed for decades as anonymous regional work. They held in their hands a photograph of a family altar from the 1940s in which the carving was visible. It had been taken during a wedding. The photograph's inscription, in an elderly hand, named the altar as belonging to the Petrov family. The museum, after verifying the claim with trusted historians and matching stylistic details, returned the carving with apologies and a small ceremony. The family wept. The museum's director, who attended, told the gathered crowd that it was one of the most humbling days of his career. The ledger, that quiet bent book, had done what good truth does. It did not simply expose wrongdoing, it forced repair. It provoked confession, it invited restitution, and it remade relationships between a public institution and the people whose histories it had held. The story did not end with neat resolutions. Some questions remain unresolved, some objects still require painstaking research, and some reputations will not fully recover. But the ledger created a new ethic, one that asked museums to be not merely guardians of objects, but guardians of memory, and memory, by its nature, is accountable to the people it represents. In the quiet of the archives now, the ledger rests on a shelf where scholars know precisely where to find it. Its pages are no longer ignored. Each entry is cross-checked, each donor note followed to its human source. The museum has become a place of active conversation rather than passive display. Visitors no longer stand before a label and accept its story at face value. They ask questions, they learn about the provenance process, and they leave with a more complicated and truer understanding of the past. This is the strange power of small things. A battered book, a penciled note, an overlooked date. They do not shout, they whisper. But if you learn to listen, they can change how institutions remember, how communities reclaim, and how history, finally, is told. What begins as a ledger ends as a conversation, and the question it leaves with us is simple but urgent. Whose stories are our museums telling? And whose stories remain waiting, patient as dust, in a metal cabinet behind the crates?